My future daughter-in-law smiled at her mother, looked me up and down, and called me a filthy old hillbilly. She thought I was too far away to hear her. She was wrong. What she didn't know was that less than 24 hours later, her powerful family would watch everything they had spent decades building begin to collapse. It all started at my son's engagement party inside the grand ballroom of the St. Regis in Atlanta. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead while guests in designer gowns and tailored tuxedos celebrated the perfect couple. Then one careless sentence changed everything. I stood there without moving. It wasn't the clinking champagne glasses that echoed in my ears. It was the sound of a father's pride being crushed. My old suit from the 90s suddenly felt even older among the luxury brands surrounding me. My hands, rough from 40 years of working Georgia's red clay, wouldn't stop shaking. I slipped them into my pockets and kept my head down. Cassandra Sterling looked flawless, the kind of woman who could charm an entire room with a smile. But behind that smile was something far uglier. She laughed softly and turned back to her mother, Deborah. Deborah covered her mouth with a silk handkerchief, as if hiding her amusement, then looked at me the way someone looks at mud tracked across a spotless marble floor. They never imagined the old farmer standing a few feet away understood every word they said. For a second, I almost left. I wanted to drive back to my farm, where people still judged a man by his character instead of the number in his bank account. Then someone placed a firm hand on my shoulder. It was my son, Malcolm. He looked straight into my eyes. There was no embarrassment, no panic, only a calm expression that didn't belong on a groom the night before his wedding. He leaned closer and whispered, "Easy, Dad. Tomorrow, they lose everything." I stared at him, searching for the anger I expected to see. It wasn't there. What I saw instead was certainty. Malcolm wasn't talking about revenge, born from emotion. He was talking about a plan that had already been set in motion. At that moment, I had no idea how far he was willing to go, or how carefully he had prepared for this. I thought tomorrow would bring an apology. Instead, it would expose lies powerful enough to shake one of Georgia's wealthiest families. My name is Eli. I've spent my entire life farming the same land my father left me. Where I come from, a promise is worth more than money because once it's broken, no amount of wealth can buy it back. The Sterling family believed kindness was weakness. They mistook humility for ignorance. And by humiliating my son and me, they crossed a line they could never uncross. Before I tell you how their world unraveled, you need to understand what that farm means to me. I wasn't born into privilege. I was born in Georgia's red clay. My farm isn't just land. It's 40 years of sweat, sacrifice, and every dream my wife Sarah and I built together. It's also the place where I buried her. Everything that happened after that night began there. Sarah used to tell me my hands were the most beautiful hands she'd ever seen. Not because they were smooth, but because they'd earned every scar honestly. After she passed away, Malcolm became the only family I had left. I raised him in the Georgia countryside, surrounded by cornfields and hard work, teaching him that a man's word is worth more than anything money can buy. When he built a successful career in the city, I couldn't have been prouder. I just never expected the woman he chose to marry. The first time I met the Sterling family was at their estate in Greenwich. The house was breathtaking, but it felt cold in a way no fireplace could fix. Wallace Sterling shook my hand with the kind of grip that said he was doing me a favor. Deborah smiled politely, yet her eyes carried nothing but quiet judgment. They didn't ask about Malcolm's childhood or our family. They asked about my farm. How many acres? Who held the title? Had the land been in the family for generations? I thought they were simply getting to know the people their daughter was marrying into, so I answered every question honestly. I told them the property had belonged to my family for generations. I even mentioned the proposed highway project expected to pass nearby. The moment I said those words, something changed in Wallace's face. It lasted less than a second, but I caught it. It wasn't admiration. It was opportunity. Back then, I ignored it. Cassandra suddenly became the perfect future daughter-in-law. She asked about my health, praised the farm, and promised she'd always make Malcolm put family first. Looking back, every compliment sounded rehearsed. My father used to warn me never to trust someone who's overly charming before they've earned the right to be. I should have listened. Out where I come from, you learn something about snakes. The dangerous ones never strike first. They wait until you stop watching. I thought we were planning a wedding. In reality, someone else had already started planning a takeover. After the engagement party, Malcolm led me across the parking lot without saying a word. The Atlanta night was cool, but sweat still rolled down my face. I wanted answers. I wanted to know why he'd stood there while Cassandra humiliated me in front of everyone. Instead, he unlocked his car, waited until we were both inside, locked the doors, and reached into the center console. He pulled out a small digital voice recorder. His expression never changed. Just calm. Just listen, Dad. A burst of static filled the car before Cassandra's voice came through the speaker. That old man is a fool. He'll sign anything Malcolm puts in front of him. She laughed. It wasn't the laugh of the woman smiling in the ballroom. It was cold, confident. Then Wallace's voice joined hers. We need that farm for the highway deal. Once we get power of attorney, 18% of the development profit is ours. A brief silence followed. Then Cassandra answered without the slightest hesitation. Don't worry, Dad. He'll never see it coming. The recording wasn't over. Cassandra's voice came back, calm and confident. Malcolm is completely under my control. After the wedding, that farm will belong to the Sterling family. I felt my chest tighten. They had never intended to welcome me into their family. They wanted the land Sarah and I had spent our entire lives protecting. To them, I wasn't a father. I was the last obstacle standing between them and a fortune. The hurt faded, replaced by anger. I turned to Malcolm. When did you find out? He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Months ago, he said quietly. At first it was just a feeling, but feelings aren't enough. I needed proof. He admitted he'd secretly planted recording devices inside Wallace's office and Cassandra's private sitting room, pretending to trust them while gathering every conversation they never expected anyone else to hear. In that moment, I realized my son had never been weak. Every insult he'd tolerated, every fake smile he'd returned, had been part of a plan. He wasn't protecting a piece of land. He was protecting our family's name. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. The Sterlings had done this before. They'd used forged documents, shell companies, and deceptive contracts to cheat struggling farmers out of valuable land, then sold those properties for enormous profits once developers moved in. We weren't their first victims. We were simply their next target. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat on the porch staring at the hands Sarah used to call the hands of an honest man. The Sterlings believed money could buy silence, lawyers could rewrite the truth, and an old farmer wouldn't understand the tricks buried inside expensive contracts. They underestimated one thing. An old lion never forgets where his claws are. As dawn approached, Malcolm finally showed me the rest of his plan. He'd already contacted Tyrone, one of the best AV technicians in Georgia and his closest friend since college. By pure coincidence, or maybe fate, the Sterlings had hired Tyrone to handle every screen, speaker, and microphone for their $1 million wedding. They believed they were hiring the best technician in the business. They had no idea they were hiring the man who would destroy them. The next morning I drove back to the farm and stood beside Sarah's grave. I promised her I would protect everything we'd built together. While Malcolm stayed in Atlanta putting the final pieces into place, I met Tyrone at a quiet roadside diner. He slid a tablet across the table and opened the wedding presentation scheduled to play during the reception. At first it looked like an ordinary love story, filled with engagement photos and romantic music. Then he opened a hidden editing track. Buried in the middle of the video were Malcolm's recordings, perfectly timed to replace the celebration with the Sterlings' own voices confessing their scheme. The trap was already set. It only needed someone to press play. Before we left, Tyrone revealed one last surprise. The Sterlings had prepared legal documents for the reception, planning to hand them to me after the ceremony when they expected me to be distracted by champagne, pride, and celebration. Hidden inside the paperwork was a clause transferring 18% of my farm's future development value before the highway project became public. Their plan was almost flawless. Almost. I picked up the guest list and slowly read the names. Politicians, investors, bankers, business leaders. Every influential person the Sterlings wanted to impress would be sitting inside that ballroom. They thought those guests were coming to witness the wedding of the year. None of them realized they were about to witness the public destruction of one of Georgia's most respected families. On the final night before the wedding, Malcolm called me. His voice was steady, almost emotionless. "Wear your best suit tomorrow, Dad," he said. "Walk into that church with your head held high. Don't be afraid, and don't question anything." Before I could ask another question, he hung up. That night, I sat alone on the porch of the farmhouse, listening to the wind move through the cornfields. Everything felt strangely peaceful, yet I knew the calm wouldn't last. By this time tomorrow, either the Sterlings would destroy us, or the truth would destroy them. I kept thinking about the powerful people who would be sitting in that church. Politicians, investors, judges, reporters. Once the truth came out, there would be no hiding it. But the Sterling family had spent decades using money and influence to escape consequences. Would tomorrow finally be different? Morning arrived beneath a bright blue sky that seemed completely unaware of the storm about to unfold. I put on my best suit, the one Sarah always said made me look respectable no matter how old it became, and drove to the church. I took my seat in the very first row on the groom's side. The chair beside me remained empty. It should have belonged to Sarah. For a brief moment, I could almost feel her beside me, silently reminding me that the truth never stays buried forever. The church looked flawless. Thousands of white roses lined the aisle, soft music drifted through the room, and every decoration spoke of elegance and perfection. It was the perfect stage for the biggest lie the Sterling family had ever told. Then Cassandra appeared. She walked down the aisle in a wedding gown worth more than most families earn in a year, smiling as cameras flashed from every direction. Guests admired her beauty, but when her eyes met mine, I caught the same look I'd seen at the engagement party. The smile never reached her eyes. The contempt was still there, hidden beneath perfect makeup and polished manners. Across the aisle, Deborah barely acknowledged my presence, while Wallace moved from guest to guest, shaking hands with investors and influential businessmen. He laughed confidently, as if he'd already counted the money my land would soon bring him. To him, this wasn't simply a wedding. It was the closing of a business deal. Finally, the pastor stepped forward and began the ceremony. His voice echoed through the silent church until he turned toward Malcolm and asked the question everyone had been waiting for. "Do you take Cassandra Sterling to be your lawful wife?" Every eye in the room shifted toward my son. Malcolm didn't answer. Seconds passed. The silence grew heavier. He looked at Cassandra, then slowly turned toward me. We held each other's gaze for just a moment before he nodded almost imperceptibly. Then he stepped away from the altar, reached for the pastor's microphone, and faced the congregation. "Pastor," he said calmly, "before I answer that question, everyone here deserves to know the truth." Confused whispers spread across the church. Wallace shot to his feet so fast his chair crashed onto the floor. "Malcolm, don't you dare!" he shouted. But the warning came too late. At the back of the church, Tyrone calmly pressed a single button. The giant screen behind the altar, prepared to display a romantic slideshow celebrating the happy couple, suddenly went black. For one long second, the entire room held its breath. Then bold red letters slowly appeared across the screen. "The truth about Cassandra Sterling and her family." Gasps echoed throughout the church. The first video began. Instead of engagement photos, hidden camera footage filled the screen. Cassandra appeared, laughing without a trace of kindness. Her voice rang through every speaker in the building. "That old man is a fool. He'll never realize he's signing away his own land." A stunned silence swept across the guests. Before anyone could react, another recording followed. Wallace's unmistakable voice echoed through the church. "Once we get power of attorney, 18% of the highway development profit belongs to us." In an instant, every smile disappeared. The applause was gone. And before anyone inside that church truly understood what was happening, the Sterling family's perfect wedding had already begun turning into the public trial they never saw coming. The atmosphere inside the church changed in an instant. The smiles disappeared, replaced by stunned silence. Then the whispers began, spreading from row to row like a brush fire. Cassandra stood frozen at the altar, unable to move. The bouquet slipped from her trembling hands and struck the stone floor. Its white petals crushed beneath the feet of guests scrambling for a better view of the screen. The confidence she'd worn all morning vanished from her face. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely afraid. The truth had stopped being a rumor. It had become evidence, and everyone in that church was watching it unfold with their own eyes. Shock quickly turned into outrage. Guests who had spent the morning praising the Sterling family were now pointing at the screen, demanding explanations. The respect Wallace had spent decades building evaporated in a matter of minutes. He shoved his way through the crowd toward the control booth, shouting for someone to cut the video, but Tyrone had planned for that. The system was locked, and the recordings continued without interruption. More evidence appeared on the giant screen. Forged contracts, altered signatures, internal documents showing how the Sterlings had targeted struggling farmers, pressured them into impossible agreements, then quietly taken control of their land before selling it for enormous profits. We had never been their only victims. We had simply been their latest opportunity. Across the aisle, Deborah grabbed the back of a chair to keep herself from falling. Her silk handkerchief slipped from her fingers as camera flashes erupted from reporters and guests, recording everything on their phones. She tried to hide her face, but there was nowhere left to hide. Years of carefully crafted prestige were collapsing faster than she could comprehend. Then Cassandra finally broke. She dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face as she crawled toward Malcolm, clutching the train of her expensive wedding gown. "Malcolm, please. This isn't what it looks like. My father made me do it. I never wanted this." Her voice echoed through the silent church, desperate and broken. Malcolm didn't move. He took one slow step backward, putting even more distance between them. Whatever love had once been in his eyes was gone. "Stop lying," he said. "You never loved me. You loved what you thought my father owned. You weren't marrying me. You were marrying 18% of a highway development." His words hit harder than the recordings ever could. Cassandra lowered her head, unable to deny them. Then an unfamiliar voice broke the silence. "He's right." Every head turned toward the back of the church. A middle-aged man in a dark suit calmly walked down the aisle with the confidence of someone who didn't need an introduction. It was Philip Wells, one of the state's most respected prosecutors. He hadn't been invited by the Sterlings. He had come because Malcolm had invited him weeks earlier. Philip stopped near the altar and looked directly at Wallace. "What I've witnessed today goes far beyond a family dispute," he said evenly. "No, the evidence presented here strongly suggests attempted fraud, conspiracy, and document forgery on a very significant scale." Wallace tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow. "You think you can intimidate me?" Philip smiled faintly, reached into his pocket, and pulled out his phone. "No," he replied. "I don't have to." He glanced toward the front entrance. "I called the state police 10 minutes ago. They're already outside." At that exact moment, the sound of sirens echoed through the church grounds. The heavy wooden doors swung open, and a team of state troopers stepped inside with calm, expressionless faces. I stood there watching everything unfold. I expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, I felt something much quieter: peace. After months of lies, the truth finally belonged to everyone. But as I looked at Malcolm, I realized this was only the beginning. Public humiliation had never been his final objective. He hadn't built this plan simply to destroy the Sterling family's reputation. He intended to make them answer for every crime they'd ever committed. There was no special treatment that morning, no whispered favors, no one stepping in to protect the wealthy. Cassandra remained on her knees as the state troopers entered the church. She looked up at them with empty, frightened eyes. Her bridal crown had slipped sideways, and loose strands of blonde hair clung to her tear-streaked face. Just minutes earlier, she had looked like the picture of elegance. Now she looked like someone whose entire future had collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses. Wallace Sterling refused to surrender so easily. He straightened his jacket and shouted, "Do you have any idea who I am?" The lead officer didn't answer. He simply walked forward, removed a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt, and took Wallace's wrists. The sharp click of the cuffs echoed through the silent church. It was the sound of a man discovering that power has limits. Deborah cried out and nearly collapsed, but no one rushed to help her. The same guests who had spent the morning flattering the Sterling family quietly stepped away, careful not to be seen standing too close. Reputation had become a liability, and nobody wanted to share in their downfall. That's the thing about high society. Loyalty often disappears faster than wealth. Two officers helped Cassandra to her feet and began escorting her toward the exit. Her expensive wedding gown dragged across the stone floor, catching broken flower arrangements and soaking up spilled water until the white fabric was stained with dirt and shattered petals. She twisted back toward Malcolm, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Malcolm, I'm begging you, don't let them take me." He never moved. His arms remained folded across his chest, his expression calm and unreadable. For 735 days, he'd lived beside the woman who planned to destroy our family. He'd smiled when he wanted to confront her, stayed silent when he wanted to expose her, and waited until every piece of evidence was impossible to deny. This wasn't revenge born in a single moment. It was justice, built patiently over 2 years. Without another word, Cassandra was escorted outside and placed into the back of a patrol car. Philip Wells walked over and rested a hand on my shoulder. "Mr. Eli," he said quietly, "it's over." I nodded, but the feeling inside me wasn't victory. It was relief mixed with sadness. We had protected our land, but we'd also learned how easily trust can be turned into a weapon. Outside, reporters crowded around the police vehicles as cameras flashed non-stop. They had arrived expecting to cover the wedding of one of Georgia's most influential families. Instead, they were documenting the public collapse of a dynasty. As I watched Wallace, Deborah, and Cassandra disappear behind the doors of separate police cars, I noticed Malcolm wasn't celebrating. He was watching, waiting. I walked over to him and asked, "It's finished, isn't it?" He looked at me for a long moment before quietly shaking his head. "Not even close, Dad." Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "These recordings only proved what they tried to do to us," he said. "Tomorrow, the people they destroyed before us are going to tell the rest of the story." I looked down at the folder. It contained sworn statements, financial records, forged contracts, and the names of families who had lost everything because of the Sterlings. That's when I understood. The wedding had never been the destination. It had only been the beginning. While the Sterling family believed their biggest problem was being arrested in front of hundreds of guests, Malcolm had already built a case that threatened everything they had spent decades hiding. And they still believed money would save them. They were about to learn just how wrong they were. The Sterlings believed the arrests were the worst part. They couldn't have been more wrong. Within hours, footage from the wedding flooded social media. News outlets replayed the recordings again and again, and something unexpected happened. People who had spent years living in silence finally began stepping forward. Malcolm had counted on it. He knew we were never the only family the Sterlings had targeted. We were simply the first ones to fight back publicly. The first person to contact Philip Wells was Candace White, a quiet woman from Savannah whose exhausted eyes told a story long before she spoke. Years earlier, she'd owned a small family farm. When she refused to sell her land below market value, the Sterlings buried her in lawsuits, fabricated contract disputes, and legal fees until bankruptcy became her only option. They bought her property for pennies, then sold it months later for a fortune. After Candace came another family, then another. Within days, 5 different farming families had come forward carrying old contracts, financial records, photographs, and handwritten notes they'd protected for years, hoping someone would eventually believe them. Sitting in the courthouse waiting room beside those families, I felt like I was looking into a mirror. The same weathered hands, the same tired faces, the same stubborn determination to protect the land their parents and grandparents had left behind. None of us wanted revenge. We wanted the truth. As the trial began, every seat inside the courtroom was filled. Reporters lined the walls, while cameras waited outside for every update. Wallace Sterling entered wearing an expensive suit, trying to project confidence, but his hands never stopped trembling. Across the room, Cassandra barely resembled the woman who had walked down the aisle just days earlier. The arrogance was gone. She sat with her shoulders slumped, avoiding the eyes of the very farmers she'd once dismissed as ignorant country people. One by one, Malcolm's recordings were played before the court. Every conversation, every hidden meeting, every plan to deceive vulnerable landowners. The forged documents were displayed beside expert testimony, explaining exactly how the Sterlings manipulated contracts and concealed profits through shell companies. Their plan to steal 18% of my farm's future development value became only one piece of a much larger pattern. The evidence showed they had repeated the same scheme for years. The judge listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes before looking directly at the defendants. Greed, he finally said, doesn't excuse criminal conduct. It simply explains it. His words settled over the courtroom like a heavy weight. Watching everything unfold, I realized something I'd never fully understood before. The truth doesn't simply expose the guilty. It gives a voice back to the people who were forced into silence. Then Malcolm revealed one final surprise. Recovering our farm had never been his only goal. Working with Philip Wells and state investigators, he'd already begun the legal process to recover assets connected to the Sterling's fraudulent deals. If successful, a large portion of those recovered funds would be placed into a trust dedicated to helping families who had lost farmland through illegal land seizures. For the first time since Sarah died, I felt genuine hope that something good could grow from so much pain. The courtroom grew silent as the judge prepared to announce his decision. Even the ticking clock seemed unusually loud. Wallace sat motionless, looking years older than he had at the wedding. Deborah quietly cried into a wrinkled handkerchief, but no one in the courtroom offered comfort. Cassandra stared down at the steel handcuffs around her wrists, the same hands that had once reached for wealth they never earned. Finally, the judge looked up from the file before him. On the charge of organized fraud, forgery of official documents, and conspiracy to unlawfully seize private property, he paused, letting the silence stretch across the courtroom. Wallace Sterling, 12 years in state prison. No eligibility for bail pending appeal. Wallace's shoulders collapsed, as though every ounce of strength had left his body. Deborah Sterling, 8 years in state prison for knowingly participating in the conspiracy. She closed her eyes and began sobbing. Then came the final name, Cassandra Sterling, for knowingly participating in and facilitating the fraudulent scheme through deception and conspiracy. Another pause. 10 years in state prison. Cassandra let out a piercing scream before her knees gave way beneath her, but this time, no one stepped forward to catch her. Cassandra looked at Malcolm one last time, her eyes filled with desperation, searching for even a trace of the man she thought she could manipulate. She found nothing. He stood perfectly still, watching as deputies escorted her away. There was no anger left in his face, no satisfaction either, only quiet certainty. He had spent 2 years building this moment, and now he refused to look away from the consequences of her choices. One by one, the Sterling family's assets were frozen. Their bank accounts were seized, their companies placed under investigation, and their mansion in Greenwich was ordered sold to help compensate the families they'd defrauded. The highway project still moved forward, but the profits the Sterlings had planned to steal never reached them. Instead, the recovered money was redirected through the court to the farmers whose lives had been torn apart by years of deception. As I stood outside the courthouse, warm sunlight broke through the clouds and spilled across the courthouse steps. For the first time in a long while, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. Justice hadn't come quickly, but it had come honestly. The Sterlings had spent their lives believing wealth could silence truth and buy loyalty. They learned too late that neither lasts forever. Malcolm hadn't simply saved our farm. He'd exposed an entire system that preyed on ordinary people and proved that patience, evidence, and courage could bring even the most powerful family to its knees. A few days later, we drove back to Georgia together. As the gates of the farm came into view beneath the evening sun, the familiar smell of earth and dry grass reminded me what we'd really been fighting for all along. Not money, not revenge, home. Malcolm never returned to his corporate job in the city. Instead, he chose to stay beside me. Together, we rebuilt the farm without fear hanging over us. Rather than selling the property after the highway expansion, we negotiated a fair partnership with the developers, protecting our land while creating a sustainable farming operation that would support future generations instead of replacing them. Several months later, Malcolm brought someone to the farm. Her name was Emily, a teacher at the local elementary school. She didn't care about property values or investment opportunities. She cared about people. I watched her walk through the fields with Malcolm, laughing as she brushed fresh dirt from her hands without a second thought. She looked at the farm the same way Sarah always had, not as land to be owned, but as a place built by love, sacrifice, and honest work. Standing there, I couldn't help but smile. Somehow, I knew Sarah would have welcomed her with open arms. Looking back now, I understand that the greatest victory wasn't seeing the Sterlings lose everything. It was refusing to become like them. We protected what belonged to us without sacrificing who we were. If this story taught me anything, it's that when something feels wrong, don't ignore it. Listen to your instincts. Protect the people you love. Stand your ground even when the odds seem impossible. Wealth can buy influence, but it can never erase the truth forever. The Sterlings lost everything because they believed greed was stronger than integrity. We survived because we never abandoned the values that built our family in the first place. And every evening, when I stand on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the Georgia fields, I remember Sarah's words about these old, scarred hands. She was right all along. An honest man's hands may never be the cleanest, but they can still build something that no amount of money can ever take away.